All righty, we are going to get started. It's so great to have so many of you with us today. My name is Jason Klein. I'm the Senior Director of Learning Partnerships at Northern Illinois University, where among the things I do is facilitate the Illinois P20 network, and we're really glad to have you. This is an overview of the second version of this study related to weighted grades and dual credit, about 4 years after the first one. We'll talk about that in a minute. And so, as we get started today, I want to kick it over to Micah Kennedy from ILACEP. Micah?
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm excited to be here and partner with Jason and the P20 Network and the Dual Credit Think Tank to deliver this information. Wanted to give a quick shout out to ILACEP. ILACEP has been around for over a decade now, and we've been working on growing and helping and supporting the dual credit network throughout the entire state. So whether you are a secondary partner or a post-secondary partner, we are working to really support all of you throughout this dual credit journey. So we host monthly webinars. We partner with great people such as Jason and other organizations in order to provide content. One of those things that we also do every year is called a dual credit summit. We do our ILSEP summit in the springtime. In the past, it had a nominal fee to it, and then we increased our fees for joining ILACEP, and then we took the registration away for this because it was all inclusive. We have now taken away all fees to join ILACEP. So we want everybody to enjoy and everything that ILACEP has to offer, all the webinars, all the resources. So if you're interested in joining ILACEP, you can go to our website. I'll put it in the chat, and you'll be able to that. So if I actually spelled it correctly. If you go to the website, when you get there, it'll be a landing page where you can just put in your information, and then we'll get you added to our listserv so that way you can get access. And then the other thing is the summit. We have our summit coming up on March 13th. Every year, every other year, we flip-flop it. So this year we're doing it in the middle of the state. And then on off years, we do it on the north and south ends of the state to accommodate everybody. So we're going to be at Heartland Community College on March 13th, right in the heart of Illinois, Bloomington Normal. And I'm going to put a link in here to the registration. That is the link to the registration form for the summit. Again, since we did take away all fees related to ILACEP, we are going back to charging a nominal fee for this. It is $45. And we are excited to have Rocio del Castillo being our keynote. The focus on this is going to be equity and access. So if you are interested in putting together a presentation during these for the summit as well, let us know. We still have some spots open for breakout sessions as well. But again, really trying to focus on the equity and access components of dual credit. So, which leads us directly into what we have to talk about today. So without further ado, I'll turn it back over to Jason. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Micah. And again, we're so glad to have everybody. So, first of all, from an Illinois P20 network perspective, we just want to call out the fact that dual credit is by definition dual, and it requires real partnership between school districts and post-secondary institutions. It literally cannot happen if two sides or both sides are not working together. And so we do believe that when dual credit is well implemented, it's really a win-win-win, a win for the students, most importantly, also for organizations on both ends, and ultimately for communities as more students are more well prepared, hopefully for both their post-secondary educations moving forward, as well as for careers with really intentional and aligned dual credit. So with that as the backdrop, this is kind of an important question, we thought, and previously 4 years ago when we did the study, we didn't talk about this out loud. So we wanted to call this out this time because obviously weighted grading is not the topic that typically dominates statewide dual credit conversations. Instead, we're arguing about teacher credentialing or discussing who gets to make which decisions about things like textbooks, talking about money related to dual credit. But here's the reason we know this is important, and it comes up frequently in our work locally within regions around the state. It'll come up through those conversations among teachers and post-secondary instructors as they're talking together. It'll come up often when we're talking to counselors or advisors at both levels. And and weighted grades, that's obviously part of the equation of course selection for students and families. In general, we all know this as educators. What we measure and how we measure it speaks to our actual values, whether or not we want to admit that sometimes. So grade point average is part of that. Oftentimes that's talked about in the context of standardized testing, but here we think that applies. And then we think that this also is just one factor, but a good symbol of kind of that whole system around not just transferability, but the transition from secondary to post-secondary. And so it's an interesting thing to look at because of that, and then maybe start diving into other elements of that transition from high school to post-secondary to careers. So that's why we've taken another look at weighted grading. And specifically, it was while we were doing work in one region, and we were talking about some transitions with weighted grading since the last study in a neighboring region. And the folks in the region we were working in at the time said, "Oh, I wonder if that's changed. I wonder how that looks now." And we immediately said, "Oh, we should restudy that. We'll do that." This survey is a little different than the survey we gave 4 years ago. So the survey we gave 4 years ago was literally, we called it a one question survey. It was really two questions. And so at the time, though, what we said is we wanted to learn about this, but these were our three caveats. We weren't promoting grades or GPAs. We definitely weren't promoting weighted grade point averages, but we were acknowledging that given that everybody gives traditional grades and awards weighted grades and has GPAs as a result, we thought it was worth studying. So this is not to suggest that when we get to the recommendations at the end, that we're saying to a school that might be standards based or competency based, oh, you should abandon that and go to a traditional grading system. That is not what we're saying at all. So when we did this last time, we had 56 responses from around the state after we had cleaned up the data, and those were our usable responses. And it represented almost a third of high school students in the state. You can see we had a really wide range of districts, and this was based on numbers of 9th through 12th graders, as few as 150 and as many as almost 12,000. And there was the average. Again, looking at these numbers, really diverse school districts from a district with only 3% of students being low income to a district with 81% of students being categorized as coming from low income families. In terms of English language learners, we had a district with 0% of students as English language learners, and another district that almost 4 in 10 were. So again, a very diverse data set. We had a private school last time, maybe a couple, and then the majority of respondents last time were secondary districts. So this was the one question. Now, the second question on the survey was, what district are you from? And that was how we were able to bring in all that other data for analysis. And so this was literally, though, the simple question we asked. And this newest survey, as many of you know, having taken it, was a more complex survey, still only about a dozen questions, but now we were really able to go after some different and additional things. So we're not going to walk through all of these, excuse me, all of these responses from last time. These are the slides that were in there last time, and we'll be sharing this out as a follow-up. But a couple key things we wanted to acknowledge, well, we'll just click through a few slides. Approximately 52% at that time, 4 years ago, said they weighted dual credit the same as either AP or honors classes. And for this, we said honors classes were a heavier weighting than regular classes, but maybe a lower rating than AP classes. And so together we call those advanced or accelerated classes. So we're not going to again look at all of these factors in detail. One thing we did do last time is pull in a bunch of other data, and we found that none of that other data was predictive 4 years ago of how school districts were weighting their grade point averages with regards to dual credit, advanced placement, et cetera. We did make a recommendation 4 years ago, and the recommendation was if you have weighted classes, we recommend that all early college coursework should be weighted the same, and it should be weighted as advanced or accelerated coursework. One of the things we've seen a couple regions since then that we know about that have taken this study, have had conversations, have seen school boards make changes to how their grades have been weighted, and have had some really interesting conversations across those regions. So one of the reasons at that time, or the list of reasons I should say at that time, that we suggested behind our recommendation was this list. And that's teacher credentialing is at least as rigorous, if not more rigorous, for dual credit coursework. Dual credit courses have different opportunities for depth and breadth, particularly in comparison to where one's knowledge and skills in the course is judged by a less than half-day test at the end of the course versus your performance throughout the course and the ability locally with the community college, the post-secondary institution, talk about what high quality performance really looks like and how we get there. The dual credit courses may be more likely, often are more likely to be actually transferable to students' post-secondary paths. And so the ability of dual credit courses across both gen ed and career and technical education courses to help us move away from an outdated model of academic courses and CTE courses being two separate paths and one being more important or beneficial than the other, and acknowledging there's benefits to both those paths, and frankly, all students should probably have a mix of both those paths, and it shouldn't be separate. And then allowing all students to equally learn and benefit from being engaged in early college coursework while still in high school and ready to transition smoothly into post-secondary to perform at that high level expected in their post-secondary environments. So we redid the survey, version 2. This time we got 63 responses. We would say that geographically, these were as diverse as version 1. We did have more Central Illinois school districts represented in this survey. Now, this time, the total number of all Illinois high school students represented, while the number of districts went up, the percentage of high school students went down. Still, almost a quarter of high school students who were represented in this survey by their districts. The fewest number of high school students in a district was down to 86. The most high school students in a district was up to over 12,000, and we saw the mean go down. So we had more smaller districts participate this time than last time. Again, we can see that very diverse responses. So our percentage of low-income students went from 5% to 82%. Our percentage of students with IEPs from 9 to 22%. One of the things we looked at this time was evidence-based funding adequacy to see if maybe school finance made a difference in some of these outcomes. We have widely varying district funding levels, with the lowest only being at 60%, 66% of adequacy, and the highest being at 168% of the amount of money that the state calculation has determined they need to successfully fund the education of their students. And this time we again pulled in teachers with master's degrees, that percentage at the district level, because that has a big impact on your ability to deliver dual credit coursework. So when we look at how the districts played out by EBF tier, and we know EBF tier gets confusing for people, tier 4 means you have the most money. Tier one means you have the least money. And we saw a pretty wide spread of districts across the four tiers, though at the same time, we had twice as many respondents in tier one as we did in tier four. District type, we had 5% of our districts not identified, but now very different set of responses, unit to secondary, compared to when we did this survey 4 years ago. Only about a fourth of our school districts responding were high school districts. The rest were unit districts. So looking at whether or not districts have weighted grades, this was actually a little bit of a surprise to me that almost a fifth of our districts, nearly 17%, said they do not have weighted grades. Unsurprisingly to me, at least, over 83% do have weighted grades. Then we asked if academic, core academic, and career and technical education courses are weighted the same. And nearly 2/3 said yes, but over a third said no, they are not weighted the same. We asked about the high school GPA scale, thought this would be a useful thing just for other high schools to be aware of. Over the last 30 years, we've seen a pretty big transition to the 4-point scale consistently, and we see that here. Over 9 in 10 districts are using the 4-point scale. Now, this is where we get into the exciting bits that you're really here for. So, how are people weighting their dual credit courses? Now, again, we consistently looked at these both gen ed, core academic classes, and then separately CTE or pathway courses. Now, we didn't ask people to put courses in which bucket, so different respondents may have put certain classes in their head in one bucket or the other. Computer science, for example, I don't really know. We didn't ask about that. But just to give you the general idea, so this is how it lays out. We've got over a quarter who are weighting their core academic gen ed classes the same as regular classes, and then we've got a preponderance of them that are weighting them 40% the same as AP classes, for example. Another almost 13% weighting them as same as honors classes, but lower than AP classes. And interestingly, we've got over 3% saying no, dual credit is weighted the highest of all. When we look at the CTE pathway courses, we see a big mix again, but now things really start to settle in a couple categories. So while in the last one, 40% were weighting dual credit gen ed classes the same as AP classes, here dual credit CTE classes, 40% are rated the same as regular classes. 35% or nearly 35% of CTE dual credit courses are being weighted the same as AP courses. So how does this compare to 4 years ago? Again, we didn't ask exactly the same question in exactly the same way, but it was pretty similar. So in 2022, this graph was already up earlier, 52% weighted dual credit, the same as some type of advanced or accelerated weighting. This time, that's up to 59% across the 4 categories. So we are seeing more districts based on this sample weighting dual credit as an advanced or accelerated weighting than we were 4 years ago. Not a huge amount more, but more. When we look at the CTE and pathway courses, which we saw just a moment ago, 49% are weighting it dual credit the same as advanced or accelerated classes. We can't compare that directly to 2022. So the results are pretty similar to 2022 overall. There hasn't been a big shift, but we did go ahead and ask some additional questions. And as you're listening, if you have questions, please go ahead and feel free to drop those in the chat. You'll also be able to come off mute in just a little bit. So some other things we looked at. How many districts have reviewed their policies since 2022? And the split here is almost 50-50. 51% have not, 49% said they have. Now, how many districts have changed their policies since 2022? Three-fourths have not, and only 25% have. So this was a surprise to me because for me, it felt like I was always in conversation over the past few years with this district or that district looking at making that policy change. Now, of course, that's the bias inherent in my job. Of course, I'm more likely to have conversations with districts who are really thinking about making those changes. And that's why they're reaching out to have those conversations. And so this was a good level set there for us to consider. Also, this will make for a good discussion in the doc class I'm teaching, where we're spending most of the semester talking about our implicit biases that we bring to whatever we're studying. So we asked a new set of questions as well about transcripts. And again, this is the kind of topic that we don't spend a ton of time on in these big statewide conversations, but it comes up frequently at the local or regional level. And we get to hear about it through talking with our community college partners who are leading dual credit work in their regions. We hear about it from counselors, sometimes from administrators. So we asked about labeling dual credit and AP courses. We've seen in work we've been able to do alongside districts that within their own district are inconsistent about how they label courses. Some courses have nothing in the title, others say DC, some say AP, some don't. It can be real all over the place. So we asked about, does your district clearly label dual credit and AP classes with text in the title on transcripts and in your student information system? And so over half of districts said yes, both dual credit and AP courses are labeled. Over a third of districts in the third column here said AP courses are labeled, and that implies, but dual credit courses are not. Only a handful of districts said only dual credit courses or neither. So kind of interesting to consider and a pretty easy process to go through at this time of year still for next year to clean up course titles before you commit your schedules sometime in the spring or summer for next school year. We also asked this question, and that's, do you label your courses with IAI course codes? Now, let me say here, the IAI course code should not be critical for post-secondary enrollment and for students to get credit for that course, because it should be the community college, the post-secondary transcript that the post-secondary institution is using to give credit for that course. But we are in complex systems filled with human beings. And so one of the things we wonder about is it helpful, and we don't really know this answer, to make sure that that people are seeing the same course codes from the high school transcript and the post-secondary transcript. And so here we asked about, are you labeling with the IAI course code? And so I was actually very surprised that nearly 10% said yes for all IAI courses. And another almost 4% said for some IAI courses. So 13% of respondents are actually doing this to some degree already, which was not something I was aware of. Now, 87% of respondents said exactly what I would have expected, which is no, we're not doing that. And Amanda will come back to your question in the chat. Thanks for dropping that in. So comparing district types. Last time we looked at secondary versus unit. So looking at that here, we can see that secondary districts, nearly 70%, over 2/3 of secondary districts who responded are weighting dual credit courses as either the same as AP or honors. So that's a pretty high percentage. That's for the core academic or gen ed. For the CTE pathway among secondary districts, that percentage is lower, but it's still pretty high, and particularly when we include the higher than regular but lower than honors or AP, so some separate category. So again, about 2/3 of secondary districts in CTE with CTE dual credit courses are weighting those more heavily than regular classes. Now, when we look to unit districts, we see this drop and shift with a lot more variance in how they're weighting them. Still a fairly high percentage, over half, when you add up the first four categories here on the left. But nevertheless, it's a lower percentage than secondary districts. And we'll comment on that in 1 second. In the CTE pathway, we see that same thing. The percentages drop. They drop fairly significantly from the gen ed and certainly in comparison to the secondary. Now, this difference between secondary and unit districts is a pattern we saw 4 years ago as well. And it's a pattern that kind of makes sense. In a unit district, we've got administrators worrying about all kinds of things, right? From early childhood to elementary literacy to our focus on career and college readiness, college and career pathway endorsements, dual credit work. In a secondary district, there's a hyper focus on those secondary topics. And so it's not unsurprising, and it's not a criticism of unit districts that this is like this. At the same time, we've now seen this pattern in 2 surveys. So for unit districts, there is this opportunity to say, huh, are we paying attention to this? Or how can we leverage nearby secondary districts that we might have a relationship with to really understand what they're doing in these spaces, to kind of, not that you have to mirror exactly what they're doing, but at least to stay on track with what some of those topics are that are being considered in secondary districts. What we don't know and might be very worthy of study is, how does this look again in other areas? So like if we compared elementary districts to unit districts. And so unit districts, we know, also probably have a whole bunch of advantages when it comes to something like the PACE framework implementation. So again, a lot to study for those of you who might be interested in pursuing your doctorates. Lots of great topics here in our setup and structure of school districts across the state of Illinois. So we also looked at EBF tier because, again, if you're in tier 4, you have more money to work with based on your student needs than do tier 1 districts. And so are you spending that money on time, energy, people that might result in some different decisions on topics like this? We can't answer that directly, but we can start to get a hint towards that based on what comes out here. And so this is a lot of data. I'm not going to walk through it all in great detail, but we see here's the tier 1 districts, core academic, gen ed classes, pretty wide distribution here, though we see 57, 58% in the 2 categories to the left. Over 60% are weighting it as advanced, accelerated courses higher than regular courses. Looking at the CTE, these numbers go down significantly among tier 1 districts, with the majority of them weighting CTE or pathway dual credit the same as regular courses. When we look at tier 2, things spread out a little bit more in some different ways on the core academic gen ed side and also on the CTE side. Again, kind of interesting. When we look at tier 3, now things are starting to fall into fewer categories. You'll remember we had fewer respondents in tier 3 and tier 4, but we still had a chunk of respondents in each. And so we've got some less variation here on the core academic and gen ed side, and we've got some more variation on the CTE and pathway side. And then when we get to our tier 4 districts, we see 62.5% of them are weighting dual credit and AP the same, and then 37.5% have said other. And so that tells us that it's some more complicated weighting differences, with some classes being weighted one way, others being weighted another way. We know that from the comments as well. But then here on the CTE side, we see that same percentage. And so that's an interesting question that would require further study. What we're not saying here is, oh, having more money means you are more likely to weight them both and both similarly and both the same as AP classes. There's more work that would need to be done across a bigger sample, but certainly there's some data here that would suggest that that would be an interesting study to understand what's happening in these districts. And for example, would more money help tier one and tier two districts look like this if this is an outcome that we really want to have? So, some interesting notes. One district described something in detail. We thought this would be interesting to share out, that they've got some criteria they use to determine how their dual credit courses are weighted. So one is, first, does the college equivalent class, is it worth at least 3 credit hours? So if the equivalent class at their community college is 1 credit hour, that is not going to get weighted heavily like an AP class would. But if it's 3 credit hours, it might. The second criteria is their 1.1 classes are given AP weighting, and their 1.2 classes are given honors weighting. So again, it's kind of an interesting. They've obviously thought this through, had some discussions, and then as new classes come on the books, come into their course catalog, they can match them up against these criteria in that district and say, this is what we're doing, this is why we're doing it, and it can kind of just happen relatively automatically. Some other interesting notes that we thought people that would be attending today might want to know about. There are a number of school districts that are offering different weights, including no weighting, for different dual credit courses. So that is not uncommon. And that's probably something to know. And the district we just showed that example from is an example of that. The other thing is there are a fair number of school districts and community colleges that are offering dual credit for advanced placement courses that have said this AP class matches up to this class we offer at the community college. And so we can offer dual credit in that advanced placement class. And that's not something that in the conversations I've been a part of is something that's often talked about, seemed relevant to highlight for people here. Again, we're not recommending or not recommending that. So we did do some higher level statistical tests with this. And like we found 4 years ago, we found that there was no predictive pattern of looking at other data. So having more teachers with master's degrees does not affect the likelihood of weighting dual credit classes more like AP classes or not, for example. Having more money, same thing. Having more students from low income households, also not affecting these outcomes in terms of how people are weighting dual credit classes for either core academic or CTE pathway courses. So we had thought some of those things might be indicators, kind of leading indicators. They're not based on this data set. Now, we've given you a lot of ideas for future research. We've got more. Do perceptions of dual credit coursework from students, families, teachers vary based on how GPAs are weighted? That's an interesting question. That might also be a little chicken and egg question there. What impact, if any, do various GPA weighting approaches for dual credit coursework have on course selection from students? This is something I've had conversations about with people that we haven't been able to study yet. What impact, if any, do GPA weighting approaches have on admissions for post-secondary institutions for students, if any? And then is there any impact of various GPA approaches to post-secondary student success? Obviously, it would be really interesting to be able to follow groups of students into their post-secondary environments and see if any of these things have an impact on their post-secondary success one way or the other. We don't know the answer to that. We do have some recommendations. So our recommendation from 2022 is unchanged. If you have weighted classes, our recommendation is that all early college credit coursework should be weighted the same and as advanced accelerated, and including an especially advanced placement and our international baccalaureate coursework. And we think it should reflect a post-secondary level of performance if you are weighting it that way. And we think that's kind of inherent to what dual credit is intended to be all about, and where the critical collaboration between post-secondary institutions and school districts takes place. We want to lean in here to the NACEP accreditation. So NACEP is the gold standard, the NACEP accreditation for how dual credit should be working. And one of the things we would offer from our perspective is even keeping in mind the accreditation can help regional conversations with what they're focusing on, how giving specific topics to reflect on as regional groups with both the post-secondary institution and the school districts. And so we think NACEP accreditation, whether you're pursuing it or not, whether you've earned it or not, has some value to look at as that gold standard and to work from for our local conversations. And so here, we know that NACEP accreditation suggests that you use the same titles in the high school as the post-secondary institution uses. And we're then also going and making suggestions to use consistent formatting related to the early college credit course types. So you can see the examples here: biology, advanced placement, principles of biology, dual credit. There isn't going to be a counselor, a teacher, a parent, a student being unclear about which course you're going to be in. Now, again, if you're offering a AP course that is also a dual credit course, that's an outlier that starts to get more complicated here. And then we're suggesting where there is an IAI course, including the IAI code for that course is another way of ensuring that we're communicating on both the community college side and the school district side. Hey, this is this IAI course, because that helps our students. And so that recommendation looks like this. And again, making this change is a pretty easy to implement change on the school district side that doesn't take a lot of time or energy and could still be done as late as now, or even in the coming months for next school year, or if it required course catalog changes, etc. Now is the time to have those conversations so that when you're updating course catalogs late summer, early fall, you're ready to do that because you've had those conversations this spring. So some stuff to think about there.